Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Sunday. Monday's not here yet. I am Brian Watt. This is John Jennings. I'm going to formally introduce him. Thanks very much for coming. We are sort of in the middle of a month when I've been thinking a lot about, well, we're coming on the end of a month when I've been thinking a lot about King and faith. I will admit that I am going to turn 50 in June, which means that I was born 2 months after Dr. King was assassinated. So the reflections that I have been having in the work that I've done on KQED and also in moderating some things for the MLK Foundation has been thinking about my mother being pregnant with me. 2 months to go in the pregnancy, and Dr. King is assassinated. She was a grad student in New York City. She would go on to be a school principal and work for the Department of Education. My father was in law school, and he would go on to be the managing partner of a civil rights law firm in the South. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. And so I've just been thinking about, because I have kids, I have a daughter who was born basically a month after Donald Trump was elected president. I'm a journalist. I'm married to a journalist. We're both journalists of color. So we have a lot of reflecting to do about how we're going to tell our kids about this time that we're in.
Yes.
So in walks an awareness of John Jennings, someone who, has found different ways to communicate about the times we're in, but also about the past and the future. And we'll talk about that with him today, in the context of the legacy of Dr. King. So let me formally introduce John Jennings. He is professor of Media and Cultural Studies and a cooperating faculty member in the Department of Creative Writing at the University of California, Riverside. His work centers around intersectional narratives regarding identity politics in popular media. He's the co-editor of the Eisner award-winning essay collection, The Blacker the Ink. You'll see an image from that in the cycle here. The Blacker the Ink, Constructions of Black Identity in Comics and Sequential Art. The co-founder and organizer of the Schomburg Center's Black Comic Book Festival in Harlem. Co-founder and organizer of the MLK NorCal Black Comics Arts Festival in San Francisco, and also SoulCon, the Black and Brown Comics Expo at Ohio State. And he was a Nasir Jones Hip Hop Fellow at the Hutchins Center, Harvard University. I will forgive him for the Harvard part, being a Yale man myself.
Oh, see.
I
didn't go there.
You were just a fellow. All right, I forgive you. It's all good. Someone has to go and do some work at Harvard, and it's usually really good work.
Okay, I think it was.
So please welcome John Jennings.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, too. It's really, it's seriously an honor. There it is, Black Twitter. Oh, you missed it. Sorry.
We've been talking about this Black Twitter image.
Yeah.
And I missed it. So I want to start with your story. I'm on my third career. I was a man of the theater. I was a man of politics. Now I'm a journalist. But I am really curious about how you got into work with images, design,
Yeah.
So we need to know where you're from.
Right. I've been pondering that quite a bit, actually, of late, just because of, various things that are happening career-wise. And, I work on a large spectrum of different types of projects. I mean, from original comics work, but I also do a lot of critical analysis work. I do a lot of curatorial work. Collaborate a lot, actually, too, because I think it's a really effective way to mentor, and actually get more work out. So I've been thinking about just career-wise, where I've started and how did I end up becoming a media studies professor. My background's in art, actually. I mean, that's where, so I'm trained as a graphic designer and a visual artist. caricature artist, cartoonist, and book designer actually too. It's like most of the books that I've worked on, I've designed myself, for instance. So I'm from the South as well. I'm from Mississippi. I was born in Brookhaven, Mississippi, which is about an hour north of New Orleans. I was raised in a small, tiny, like one stoplight town called Flora, Mississippi, which is about 15 miles north of the capital, Jackson. Our claim to fame is where the petrified forest is. So that's about it. Other than that, yeah.
Okay.
It's a nice forest. It's nice. Yeah, and so to think about like how I really became interested in images, I think I was very interested in images super early. I think probably a lot of people don't realize, but it is a type of literacy. It is a type of working through. It's a type of problem solving. I think a lot of times we get really caught up in this notion of like these old rote ideas about reading and writing, right? Which is awesome. You got to do that, right? But there's also like historical literacy, visual literacy, different modes, historical literacy that all like encompass various modes of how we actually, perform our humanity or deal with humanity. And images, for some reason, particularly when you look at comics, are like sublimated to this kind of juvenile space, but they're actually very symbolic and complex, and that's the thing. So I think so. My mother, I was raised by my mother primarily, and my grandparents, right? So. My mom went to Alcorn State University, which is another historically black college in Lorman, Mississippi. And she ended up becoming a literature major. She became pregnant with me and actually did not finish, and ended up moving back in with her estranged mother, And so that was really interesting, I guess, because I wasn't there yet. But it sounded interesting. So I think she always had her books around. She always had her books around. Flora is a very agrarian, tiny space. It is extremely segregated. I was born in 1970, so of course, there is still like a lot of, segregation in the space as far as like schools and, resources, and they still are, actually. Mississippi is still a very contentious space, let's just say that. So anyway, so she always encouraged me to read everything, right? My grandmother was a quilt maker, and just looking at the things that she used to say, I think she probably was a root worker as well. I think she actually did conjure work and things things that I used to think were like superstitious back in the day. Now from my research, I say, wait a minute, she probably was a conjurer, or she probably was working in that particular space. So you have that. It's I'm growing up in the woods, like literally. When I say the sticks, like if you say the term the sticks, that's where like a picture of my house would be there in a dictionary when you say sticks. And it's almost like stereotypical, upbringing. You came up almost abjectly poor, in the middle of a cotton field, that kind of stuff. It was like, that came up like severely financially challenged, to say the least. And I had a lot of imagination. I actually started making images super early, probably before I could actually write. And my mother had, books around psychology and illustrated books around science. And she was a huge reader of science fiction and fantasy and horror and stories of the supernatural, and I just kind of gravitated towards that super early, actually. And I think the idea of the icon was something that really, I didn't know that I was actually becoming a graphic designer or a visual communicator at the time, but there was something that attracted me to visual communication super early on. So I started drawing around the age of 4, something like that.
That's what I was going to ask.
And
when did you start drawing to know you could draw?
Yeah, it was around 4. It was around 4. I had an uncle, my uncle Willie Albert, who at the time was an extremely talented artist. He could pretty much draw anything, And I think by this time, my mother had actually like given me my first comic books, little knowing that she had created an obsession that would become like, my career. So for instance, I was reading like stuff like Greek mythology and Roman mythology and Egyptian mythology and Norse mythology at a super early age. I was reading at an accelerated level, like super early. And she gave me like, my first like Mighty Thor comic book, by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. And she gave me my first Spider-Man comic, my first Daredevil comic book, Moon Knight and all these, wild characters, And I was like, oh my goodness, these are like the gods and goddesses that I was just reading about, but they're like I don't know, somehow cooler. I don't understand, you know.
Right.
And and so I just started trying to make my own, you know. And before you know it, I was drawing the stuff a lot. And we didn't have art classes at the school, but I always had an aptitude for it. And so, you know, I went from there. I did really well in school, but I actually did not. I didn't go to college at first. I actually went to the military first, and you know, because I was 17, I graduated early, and you know, I was valedictorian, and you know, but no one told me that you should go to school. It was really tripped out, you know. And I ended up having an accident where my foot was injured. I actually have a piece of steel in my right foot, holding my third metatarsal together. And it turns out that our school actually required you to take the ACT, and it turns out that I had done well enough that I actually had a scholarship still at Jackson State, you know. So I was like, so I actually was able to get a scholarship, but I was convalescing from my surgeries, and I'm pretty sure I was the only freshman in 1989 at Jackson State that signed their scholarship papers while like convalescing in a military hospital. Wow. So, you know, and so I was literally on the wrong path. It's almost like the universe was like, you know what? And because we're talking about faith, right? I mean, this is. I would almost argue that God broke my foot, you know what I'm saying? You know, and saved me from not necessarily making a mistake, but just the wrong decision. You know what I'm saying? I would never say that going to the military is a mistake. You know, I would say that it was a decision that I think was stopping me from my true destiny. You know, and so when you look at it that way, it's like, yeah, there was something that had really realigned my fate, so to speak. So I did really well at Jackson State. I majored in art. And I had a minor in drawing. At the time, I actually was working for the campus newspaper, the Blue and White Flash, as a cartoonist. I was kind of a hustler, so I made a lot of flyers for the Greek organization parties. You know, okay. That's how I made money. I used to call myself up all night graphics. You could call me any time of night, and I would actually make a flyer for you. I'll come out of sleep. You know, so what do you need? When is it going to be? Okay, and I'll draw it. They come and pick it for $10 to $12, you know, $20 if it's a super rush.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
That's a lot of money on a college campus, you know, seriously. Especially for someone, you know, who didn't have the wherewithal to have their own money. So, so from there, you know, I actually ended up doing some work at the Clarion Ledger, which is like the biggest newspaper in Jackson, you know, in the state of Mississippi. And right out of school, I was doing illustration work and like, you know, graphic signage and things for the paper. But it just wasn't, I don't think it was enough for me, I guess. I was still curious about what else I could do.
And at
so,
this point, were you off to the side drawing the speculative, the supernatural?
Always,
Always. So this was something that was happening
super early,
while you were in college. I'm curious if you were able to display some of that work and how the Black experience, how your experience played into the work, but also how the community received your work. How if you felt embraced. Because to me, it strikes me as something different. And I would be curious to know how it was received by your peers.
Well, you know, I think later on it started to become really well received, you know, later on. I think that, you know, people, a lot of artists don't like to hear this, but they say, hey, you have potential to be really good at this. You know, you always think that you're done. It's like, oh, I can draw. You know, this is raw material though. You know, what are you drawing from? You know, I think about like drawing as not just mark making, but literally drawing something out. Like how do you pull something into existence? You know, it's a really powerful act because you're actually using something that's imaginary. You know, lines don't exist in actual space. You're using magic to a certain degree. Lines are like magic, and so, you know, how do you actually pull those things out? You know, and I didn't have enough experience to realize what type of things I wanted to do. I mean, I was still, you know, emulating things, you know, and I think that's where you start. You start by tracing, you start by like emulating things, and then before you know it, you actually develop a style. A style really is a system of decisions, you know. Whenever you choose to use this particular color to mean something, or if you leave something out on particular, or if you choose to use a particular medium, that's a system of decision making that equals into a style, right? So I think that I hadn't really developed that yet at that time, you know. I needed to go to school. That's why I think after the accident, I felt like whatever thing that I was listening to, inside of myself, I just went with it, you know, because inside of me, I knew that I wanted to be an artist, but I still listened to other people and went to the military,
Right.
and that was a mistake for me, right? So I say if I listen to what's inside of myself, then I think that that is the way to go. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I did. So I was like, you know what? I have this job. It's the most money I've ever made in my life. You know, it's got benefits. You know, it's a Gannett paper. You know, so it's USA Today and all those papers, right? Little did I know that this thing called the internet would come and totally demolish the print industry, right? I don't know. Whatever inside of me maybe knew. I don't know. So I ended up going to graduate school at the University of Illinois. My first master's degree is in art education. While I was there, I actually applied to that program, the MFA program for graphic design, 3 times. First 2 times I failed, you know, because I didn't know what graphic design was. I just thought that it was interesting and I wanted to know more about it, right? And so I just like, well, I'm gonna try for it, right? And they were like, nope, not good enough. Nope, not good enough, right? Right? And so what I started doing was actually sitting in on their classes, their undergraduate classes, which is, that was an excruciatingly embarrassing situation, because it'd be like my age and actually like sitting with kids younger than me who are just designing around circles around me, you know? But I went backwards through their curriculum because of when I started, you know? And so what ended up happening is I actually ended up getting into the program and becoming one of their strongest graduate students. And eventually I became the first African-American professor to get tenure at the University of Illinois in the history of the school. And I was the first black chair of that program, the same one that said I wasn't good enough to be in. Now, after that too...
Interesting how it happens like that sometimes.
I mean, yes, exactly. And so, you know, little by little, I actually ended up mentoring 2 more African-American students who teach there now. And so one of which is Nikita Thomas, who's the first African-American woman to become tenure track there in that program. Okay. She works there now. Wow. So, you know, it's been a really interesting ride, so to speak. And in the middle of that, I started doing research on, you know, what I would come to know as Afrofuturism, right?
Which I'm going to ask you to explain, because I know you'll do a better job than I will, even though I did my homework. I was going to try to take you to Afrofuturism next.
Right.
So,
well, it kind of jumped off during my when I was doing my tenure work, you know, at University of Illinois, right, which is like early 2000s or so. I was doing these cyborg, and I don't have any in here, but I was doing like these kind of black cyborg images. You guys, show of hands, everybody know what a cyborg is? No? It stands for cybernetic organism. So it's like, you know, you ever seen the Terminator? Okay, he's a cyborg, yeah. So it's like metal and flesh, you know. So I was thinking about like, I think I recently reread like Frantz Fanon's The Fact of Blackness, and I was thinking about how blackness as a identity is created. You know, it's something that we kind of, you know, you're not born black. You become black. You know, it's a designed object that kind of encompasses you. And you'd say, hey, you're black. Deal with that. Oh, what am I doing? Oh, you know, you're not. Yeah. And you're not born white. That kind of thing. It's something that's actually socialized and it's a construct. And so I was really interested about that idea, right? So something that's constructed is like a device, right? So I was like, okay, well, that could kind of be the metallic part of it, you know, like the thing that's socialized, and the real part is the flesh part, the thing that we are inside. So those particular things are always kind of like battling with each other, right? So that's why I did this series of like 75 images that just came out of me. I just could not stop making them, you know, and it was really surreal. You know, I barely slept, and they were digital images, and they just kind of flowed out of me over 4 days, 75 images, you know.
And how old were you at this point?
I was, let me see, I was in my early 30s, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, so over a decade ago, give or take. And I don't know, I was really inspired by like, you know, Japanese manga and, you know, historical photography and things of that nature. And so I called the series The Fact of Blackness, because excuse me, that's not true. Matters of the Fact, because I was actually inspired by Fanon's piece. So when my friend Dana Rush saw the images, and she's an Africanist, right? She saw the pieces and she was like, those look Afrofuturist. And I was like, you are making up words. I don't know what that is. What do you mean that looks Afrofuturist? I have never heard of that. But then once I did some digging, I realized, like, wait, this actually does relate to what people are calling Afrofuturism. The original term was coined by this cultural theorist, Mark Derry, in 1993. He has this collection of essays called Flame Wars, and they're all about cyberculture. You know, there was this thing called the World Wide Web that was actually being like created, you know, in the early 90s, right? And people were they were doing a lot of discourse around how it functions, you know, and how and what could we do with it culturally, right? And so what he did is he picked up on a vibe of like Black cultural production that he saw related to like music and art and, you know, aesthetics and narrative, you know. And so he wrote this piece called Black to the Future, right? Where he interviews Samuel R. Delaney, Trisha Rose, and Greg Tate, you know. And so he postulates this notion of a Black technoculture, right, that actually utilizes futurity and technology in a particular way that is for upliftment of Black cultural production spaces. Now, I actually put, you know, I typed out something right quick because, you know, there are some issues, I think, with his, you know, with how he defined it. I think one of the things is that, and this is actually not necessarily an issue, it's a really interesting thing, because even when he's like postulating it, in his definition, he puts, for lack of a better term.
Huh.
And I like that because it leaves possibility.
Right.
You know, he's like, you know
you
what?
might find another term.
Or you might find something, and I like that. You know, even it says it's almost like the antithesis of a definition. You know what I'm saying? For lack of a better term, I'm gonna call it Afrofuturism, right? Okay. And so that's kind of how it went. And I dig that because since then, you know, the resurgence of it fairly recently, we've been kind of dealing with, you know, various aspects of it. I typed out something. Can I find it? Oh, an Afrocentric speculative technocultural production. That is production system, that privileges the political and creative needs of Black people. So when we think about technology, we're not just thinking about, you know, the cell phone I just looked at, right? Or the projector that's projecting these images. We're also talking about extensions of ourselves, right? So religion, race, you know, gender, these different expansive things, history even is a technology, right? Because it gives us access to things around us, right? So it's like a more expansive idea around what technology is, you know. And so how does an Afrofuturist aesthetic differ from, say, like a traditional science fiction aesthetic, you know? This notion of like non-linearity of time, for instance, you know, ancestral worship, or the privileging of, you know, multi-gendered notions of leadership. So for instance, like Afrofuturism tends to be a lot more womanist friendly. You know, it actually is more about like the equity of male and female aspects, you know, that kind of thing. Or the notion of time travel, or time not being like this linear space, or not even needing a time ship, for instance. Back on the back table, you know, I did the graphic novel adaptation of Octavia Butler's Kindred, right, which is about a Black woman who is inexplicably, you know, teleported back through time, you know, to save her extremely racist great-great-great-grandfather, Rufus Whalen, right? But she has to do it because if she doesn't save his life, then she won't exist.
She doesn't exist.
But then she doesn't use like a DeLorean or a TARDIS to do this, right? She actually like there's some type of mystical connection, some kind of spiritual connection between these. And so this notion of the spiritual is actually an inherent aspect of, I think, of Black speculative cultural production, right? Even more so than most other spaces. So around the same time that Derry was writing this book, Flame Wars, there's another gentleman named Eric Davis that wrote this book called Technosis. Technosis, in his definition, was about this really interesting connection between the spiritual aspect and the technological aspect and how they overlap, right? But guess what he ignores? Almost totally. Black folk. So it's like for us, like the way that you know, that we actually think about spirituality, you know. So those are some of the.
Do you think he ignored it because he?
I don't think he ignored it. I mean, because there are references. He did a piece about like, you know, Eshu Elegua, the spirit at the crossroads, right? He did a piece. He did reference the Egyptians, but as far as like a more deeper understanding of some of the more mystical aspects, or, you know, supernatural aspects of just, you know, Black spirituality, he didn't really deal with. And I don't think it's just ignoring. I think it's just research. You have a time frame, you know.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's kind of how I ended up working in Afrofuturism. And from then on, I just kept stumbling over people that were working in the same area. And so over the last, decade or so, it seemed to have been like a massive resurgence of interest in, Black speculative culture. And so you...
And when you say, just for everyone, Black speculative culture, sorry to
Right.
make you
No, it's cool.
spend all your time defining terms.
Right.
But I think it helps if people
Right.
understand what you mean.
So anyone read like any science fiction or fantasy or
Right.
horror or anything outside of what people think of as reality? So for instance, that includes like fantasy work, magical realism work, things that actually are kind of pushing against the boundaries that we think is actually real, So when we talk about like Black speculative work, we're talking about work from people as early as, say, Zora Neale Hurston or like W.E.B. Du Bois even wrote speculative fiction, by the way. George Schuyler's work, Black No More. Anybody ever read Black No More? It was written in 1931 by George Schuyler. It's about a device that actually allowed Black people to become white people. That's sci-fi. That was written in 1931.
1931.
So if you go back even further, I mean, you're talking about stuff like, my colleagues, Britt Russert and Adrian Brown, they found in W.B. Du Bois's papers a piece that I think was written in like the early 1900s by Du Bois that was called The Princess Steel, and it was a science fiction fantasy story. They found in his papers. They're going to actually put it out in a collection of his work. So what is it about the notion of like speculation and Blackness that actually go hand in hand, right? And if you want to talk about like, Dr. King's work, I mean, so for instance, everyone's familiar with, the notion of the mountaintop, right? That King puts forth. This mountaintop where everyone's equal, holding hand. It's a utopic space, right? So if you pull out your GPS, device, do we know where that mountaintop is?
I don't.
I haven't found it yet.
Right.
Do you know where it is? Is it close by? Is it in DC? No, it's not a real space. It's a heterotopic space. It's a dream space. It's a liberation technology that he created as a metaphor, right, to get us to think about what these future spaces could be, right? And that's really interesting to me. It's a Black utopia, or it's a utopic space for all of us, right? And building off of that, anyone know who Nichelle Nichols is? From Star Trek. Yeah, she's Lieutenant Uhuru, right? So at the time when Star Trek was on, she was probably the only Black face on mainstream television, right? Little do people know she was really good friends with Dr. King, right? The story goes that she actually was getting ready to leave the show because she actually felt that she wasn't being effective on the space. She felt like, okay, well, I'm kind of tokenized a little bit. And she wanted to go back into Broadway. She actually is a very talented dancer, right? So from what I understand, Dr. King and his family would watch this show every week, right? It was one of the only shows that he could probably watch with his family, and they loved it, right? And he basically was like, you please don't leave this show, Nichelle, because you represent us in the future. Wow. You represent us in the future, right? And so he's already thinking about the importance of those types of narratives. Yes, for a long time, I thought her first name was Lieutenant. I guess it's Neota. I don't know who her people are.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And she's isolated. Like, what tribe is she from? Where she come from? I don't really know that much about where she is. I'm sure they've built that out. I'm not a Trekkie necessarily, but I'm sure they've built it out over the years. But what I'm saying is that she was, like a lot of those characters, tokenized characters, but she represented an entire race of people, like for real, on television, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, but what about Avery Brooks? I think he's a really spectacular actor and deep.
No. Avery Brooks is great, but let me. We're gonna.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. And actually one of his episodes.
Definitely glad you brought him up.
No, but we're talking about the connection between Dr. King and that particular space.
Star Trek.
No, not the whole canon. No. You're absolutely right about that. In fact, one of my favorite episodes. Never mind. I'll geek out. Don't do that. I'll geek out. Seriously. Sorry.
I think it might be okay.
Yeah, yeah. So
But,
anyway, but yeah,
yeah,
so
okay.
that notion of like moving forward in that space, I mean, that was something that I think King was very concerned with, right? And there's a book called Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelley that talks about this idea that in order for you to move forward with any type of revolutionary idea or movement, you have to first imagine yourself in that future. You know, you have to first have the narrative to imagine yourself being free to actually moving forward, right? I would even put forth that the first like true Afrofuturist was the first slave that said, you know what? I don't think I like this slavery thing. I think perhaps I shall follow that star and I shall go, you know, because I deserve a better future, you know, that kind of thing. You know, you think about the people that actually migrated on faith, you know, up from our ancestors, up from down south to the promised land, which would be Chicago, south side Chicago, or other spaces like New York or what have you. They were dreaming of a better future. They actually were moving on not only their own actions, but the things that were going to affect their future generations. You know, we deserve better than this. There's got to be something better than this. And so that idea of like pondering the future is something I think that has always kept people going forward. Everyone who comes to this country, you know, well, we were brought here, but you know what I'm saying? You know, it's about the dream of a better life, you know. So anyway.
Let me ask you about the image of Dr. King as it appears in this kind of work. I mean, like you have just broke down how he might have been his own Afrofuturist. That was very powerful for me. But I'm curious, when the Afrofuturist designer, drawer, artist actually sits down and starts to work with the image of Dr. King, what that's like, what are pitfalls you try to avoid, what you worry about, when you present his image in this kind of work, if you know.
You know, that's a great question. We actually did a giveaway book that was part of the Black Comic Arts Festival for the first one, right? It was in partnership with the BART, right? And so we got this idea that we wanted to actually have our character, Kid Code, who's on one of these pieces. He's actually a hip hop time traveler. If you can imagine, like Doctor Who mixed with like Africa Bambaataa and Green Lantern.
All right.
Yeah, like that. So yeah, and so he's a time traveler. And so basically, we set up this idea that these people were being like kept in this kind of stasis, and they were on this kind of train, because we wanted to relate the idea of a freedom train to BART. You know, it was, you know, they were paying for it and they had to connect it, right? And so we wanted this idea that they needed the oratory skills, the power of Dr. King's voice to wake up these people and save them, right? And in order to do that, they, you know, Kid Code and his associate Roxy Clockwise had to travel back through time before, you know, before he became the Dr. King, right? And actually have him, you know, save these people, right? And so it was trippy because we wanted him definitely to look enough like himself, but a lot of it had to be caricatured, and you want to be respectful of his image.
Right, right.
You know, cartooning is about abstraction, so it's not necessarily about representation. It's about like, you know, connecting different types of like symbolic communications. Comics are very surreal, and they're very abstract. You know, so that's the thing we had to kind of play around with. But utilizing him in that way, I think we did a great job of respecting his legacy. But also playing off of the fact that he is still affecting the future. So the thing is about Afrofuturism is that, you know, it's always about co-presence. You know, all these things, all time collapses, you know. A really like Afrocentric belief is that your ancestors are always with you, you know. Anyone ever seen this film called Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash? Yeah. You remember the part where like the little girl who's haunting the present, but she's actually not born yet? She's the ghost of a baby just yet unborn, right? Right? So, and I think I just got chills just thinking about that. It's beautiful, right? But it's about the decision-making processes that are happening that are affecting the future. And if you do most of the best time travel stories are about ripples in time, you know. How do you, when you change something, how does it make other things happen, you know? And so at the end of it, because they had the power to, they showed him the mountaintop in our story. Yep. So,
Yeah,
and then at the
and
end of it, and so when he comes back, he's talking to his kids and his wife Coretta, and he's like, you know what, I had this dream, and so they walk up into the sunset, so it's basically like, that was a really interesting piece. Now, there was this episode of the third version of the Twilight Zone, with Forrest Whitaker as the Rod Serling character. I don't know if you've seen this, but there was an episode that Eric LaSalle did where he actually had the chance to either save Dr. King or save this child that eventually would save his own life. And he chose to save the child because he had made this connection to this child. If you ever get a chance to check it out, you could probably find it on YouTube or something. But when I saw it, and this is something he wrote and directed for, that particular version of Twilight Zone is horrific, by the way. The best thing about it was that episode.
Right, interesting.
I'm sorry, Forrest Whitaker. But it wasn't that good. But that episode just stuck with me because it was talking about, like, in order for certain things to actually transpire, sometimes things that we think of as negative or traumatic have to occur, and that's the other thing too.
Like when you injured your foot.
Like when I injured my foot, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And actually, if you've seen the recent Dave Chappelle show, he talks about that too, about the Emmett Till case as well.
Right.
So, as far as, like, we try to be respectful, but also know that there's only a few images of Dr. King that we can use, and so you have to extrapolate from those things. And a lot of times you are imagining based off of the images that you're seeing, like what he would look like, that kind of thing.
One of something that's in the rotation here involves, is it a Dr. Xavier King? Or
Oh yeah.
I was kind of curious.
You curious about that piece? Yeah. So
just the story behind that.
right. So seriously, anybody read comic books in the room besides me? Okay. So you know who Jack Kirby was? Stan Lee. Yeah. So they're two of the. So everybody, pretty much everybody that's seen a Marvel Comics movie knows who Stan Lee is, right? He's always a little old guy who's in every movie, right? He co-created the entire spectrum of characters, from like Spider-Man to Fantastic Four. A lot of people didn't really know who Jack Kirby was, though. Jack Kirby was this kind of silent partner, always in the corner chomping on a cigar, creating work. He co-created everything, from like Captain America to Iron Man to the Avengers, right? So me and my friend Stacey Robinson, we were basically talking about the fact that, the Avengers movie had just made $1 billion. That's right, $1 billion with a B, right? And how his family, Jack Kirby's family, was like, I know that what my father did for you guys was like work for hire, but what do you think about maybe breaking us off a little remuneration for our father's creation, They were like, and Disney Marvel was like, no, we're not going to do it. And so, most of the early comics creators in our country were Jewish, either Jewish immigrants or sons and daughters of Jewish immigrants, And so Jack Kirby's real name is Jakob Kurtzman. Stan Lee's real name is Stanley Lieberman, right? A lot of them, waspified their names to kind of fit in. And a lot of times, the only things that these Jewish teenagers could get were jobs with comics. Were actually at the same. Early on, comics were considered to be very low. Actually a couple of steps above pornography, honestly. Sorry, did I just say that? Sorry. But it's the truth. It's the truth. I mean, it was not looked at as a very reputable position. But what they did is they actually took this really kind of low form and made it into something great. They were geniuses, right? They were creating entire worlds, And so for them to say, you know what, no, we're not going to give you anything, even though we just made $1 billion, it's just, there's a difference between like the law and then what's right sometimes,
Right.
So me and my friend Stacy were like, man, they treating that brother like he black. And we're like, oh, yeah, we might as well call him Black Kirby. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's actually a pretty interesting idea. So we created a entity that we started creating work through that examined Jack Kirby's aesthetic through an Afrocentric lens. And yes, and so Black Kirby actually started making this swath of work, And there's certain things, for instance, there's this film coming out in a couple of weeks called The Black Panther. I don't know if you heard about it. Okay, Black Panther was created 3 months before the Black Panther Party started calling itself the Black Panther Party. Did you know that? Yeah, man, it was created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. Two Jewish men said that, you know what? Jack Kirby said, you know, I have a lot of black friends, and I want them to have I want them to have a character too, you know. So they actually created this character to uplift African Americans, you know. And some would argue that they could have created an African American character to do that, but they created this idealized African king, right? And so we were like, what? Well, those types of things we made more explicit. We actually have an image that Stacy did of Huey Newton sitting in the chair, you know, the kind of like the wicker chair, but it's T'Challa, the Black Panther. So we're actually making that connection more explicit. So this is the piece you're talking about,
Right.
the Uncanny Kingsman. Some people say that when they created these characters, that Dr. King was an example of Xavier, and that Magneto, his villain, was Malcolm X. You know. Now, I mean, that's a very contentious thing, and actually, it's a retroactive continuity thing that they did, you know, as it moved along. Actually, Magneto was just a megalomaniac. You know, that's not true. But Black Kirby was like, if we're making this alternative world, like, what if that actually is true? You know. So we actually started making these kind of like, I call them artifictions instead of artifacts. Called artifictions of like fake covers and, you know, postulations on things that could have been. You know what I'm saying? And that's what Black Kirby started doing. Yeah, and that's where that came from.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've reached this point where someone might want to talk about Avery Brooks. But
Oh, yeah,
we-
yeah,
but
sure.
this
You
is
go
where
on.
I was asked to open it up to the audience for anyone who would have questions. I obviously would like to hear a little bit more about your anticipation of the Black Panther movie, but
Yeah,
but
I'm
we
excited
can
about
come
it.
back to that. If anyone in the audience has a question for John Jennings, we'd love to have it.
Not all at once. I'm just kidding.
If anyone is
Yeah,
curious.
yeah.
Well, I used to read not just Marvel, but DC.
I made everything. Yeah.
And also because as a person of color, it was like we didn't have any heroes and heroines, but we had the comic books.
That's right.
And that's what we looked at.
Mhm.
And even something like there was a Tarzan comic book.
Problematic.
And they had, like, a black and white twins, in Africa.
Yeah.
This whole series, and then of course all the cowboys.
Yes.
Or you get Tonto.
Yep.
Or you get, Cisco Kid. I mean, you do get these people of color.
Spotted around.
This is in the 40s, 50s,
Yep.
and 60s.
Yep.
And then when Bill Cosby comes along with I Spy, it's like, hey, we don't have to be in outer space. We can be playing tennis.
Mhm.
There's this whole genre, and so a lot of us did learn how to read by reading things like DC and Marvel.
That's right.
Marvel really came out, but also they have things like there were all these military guys.
Oh yeah, like Sergeant Rock or like Nick
Yeah.
Fury. Yeah, I used to read all that stuff.
And
Yeah.
Jade with a horn.
Yep.
Who was black.
Yeah, that's right. The black man playing the trumpet in the.
And so I wanted to know that that's how some of us grew up. Right
Yeah.
in the Fillmore.
Right.
And then what happens, of course, in the 60s and 70s.
Underground.
When the hippies come out with all the colors.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at the images there, and everything relates because it becomes global when the United States has the Peace Corps and the white kids go out and see what the third world is like and then they come back.
Mhm.
You then get the hippie. I don't know if you saw the stuff at the De Young.
No.
They did some of the beautiful posters that are really, there's a lot of black folks and people of color, third world folks.
Oh, yeah.
too. And so the comic part is I just find it fascinating. So if you could talk a little bit about, are those all yours?
Yes.
Your work?
Yes, ma'am.
And could you say something about them?
Well, I hope.
He treated me to this before it started.
hope you
Before
like
all
some.
of you all arrived, we kind of went through some of these slides, and he told me about some of them.
Well, like
Julian Bond,
yeah.
okay.
so when he passed away.
Yeah, he just passed.
Yeah, well, not too long ago. Yeah.
I just think about Shirley Chisholm, like, people don't know who Shirley Chisholm or Eddie Williams are.
Yeah. I mean,
Boy, those people were alive, and nobody knows.
Maybe this one, yeah, okay.
I mean, a lot of my work has been about digging back through particular aspects of history and representing things. Not representation, but representation, right? So one of the aspects that I created about Afrofuturism. Anybody familiar with the term Sankofa? Sankofa.
Sankofa.
Sankofa is a West African term. Thank you. It means go back. It literally means go back and get it. Or it's like it's no shame to go back and get something that you left and bring it back to the front, right? And so I've kind of posited this idea of Sankofaration, right, which is like narration and Sankofa kind of spliced together. So I've been very actively trying to go back and get it, go back and get the things some of the things that you've talked about, but hopefully graphically. For instance, just like for instance in where was he from? Sacramento. Larry Fuller. Larry Fuller lives in Sacramento. He was actually one of the only 3 African Americans in the underground comics movement, along with like Grass Green, who created the first black independent superhero in 1970. It was called Eben. There's only one issue. Created it right here. Right? A lot of people never heard of this man, you know. But I've actually had the honor to become friends with him, and I want to actually take this character, represent it, and update the character and expand upon that character's adventures, right? A lot of things around Afrofuturism and black speculative culture is going back and trying to show new generations the power of the narrative, the power of the things that have come before, that you are not by yourself, that you're not isolated historically, that these things are powerful and they have meaning and resonance, you know, outside of just being these artifacts that have no connection to your heritage, you know. So these are the things that we're really, concerned with. And so when I'm creating these conferences, like co-creating these conferences and things of that nature, basically, I'm trying to restart or realign the idea of black subjectivity, you know. And what I mean by that is, like, a lot of times when we think about stereotypes are about fixity, right? In fact, and I say this all the time, the root word of stereotype is the word stereos, which is the Greek for hard or fixed, and they function as ways of trapping you in a particular way. So when you talk about something that's subjective, it's more mutable, right? It's something that's mutable. So by creating spaces where like black kids come and they can see artists of color from various backgrounds, from various actually faiths or what have you, they're actually seeing themselves reflected back at them, you know. And that's an extremely empowering thing that a lot of people, who are in power take for granted, right? So over the last few years, you know, we've actually literally like realigned the psyches of like over 40,000 people, you know. So you're talking about kids who never have to know what it's like to not be central to a story. And that's an extremely empowering thing. And so they won't allow themselves, hopefully, to become stereotypes. They'll actually create things and relate back to these types of images that they're going to know about. Like, you know, so I can see one of these kids being like 25 years old say, hey, you remember when we used to go to the BCAF and you would see all these images of everyone, everybody be there having a great time, you know? I want to do something like that. You know, we didn't have that coming up. And I know that sounds like everybody said, I didn't have that, you know? Right. We didn't have this internets, you know what I'm saying? But, you know, these types of images, I wanted to make, they want to be about joy and our pain and about our historical connections to all these figures like Jimi Hendrix or what have you, that I grew up like looking up to, you know. Like you saw Angela Davis image in there, right? Angela Davis is one of my heroes. I almost like flipped out when I met her. She probably thought I was a crazy person. Anyway, I was like, you're Angela Davis. And I'm like, yes, I am.
She probably gets that.
She probably gets that laugh. Exactly. Or Sonia Sanchez or Mary Baraka or, you know, all these amazing people, you know, that throughout history that are superheroes. I mean, if you think about it, like everybody had a picture of Dr. King, probably JFK, and a white Jesus, right? On the wall. That was on my grandmama's wall, right? And so these are our superheroes. These are our avatars. These are people that we look up to. You know, they help build, you know, a sense of community and history through the imagery that we see. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here.
Yes.
I grew up on DC Comics too, and in 7th grade, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, a year later, I went to a Roman Catholic school in the Midwest. We used to get a monthly comic book called Treasure Chest.
Oh.
And in 1964, one of the series in there was the story of a black man called Pettigrew, who ran for president of the United States.
Really?
I'll talk about black futurism.
Yes. Is that from the? I'm sorry. Continue.
I would love to go back. You know, when Obama was elected, that flashed back to me, but I never.
Wow.
Pettigrew. Okay, so I had never heard it.
Treasure Chest Comics.
I wonder if it's.
And I don't know who the editors or illustrators.
I wonder if it's part of like the golden treasure, like the golden key stories that were coming out of from the East Coast, because there was a
These
publisher.
were for good little Catholic kids. with
Huh.
funds, but
I am not hip.
planted that amazing futuristic idea.
Definitely.
I don't even remember if the guy won.
Wow.
He became president.
But the fact that existed, see, that's what I'm talking about. See, that's extremely powerful. And then, for instance, do you guys know Tom Feeling's work? He did this. He's most famous for this collection of images called The Middle Passage, right? The beautiful images, black and white images. But he did a comic strip called Tommy Traveler, and it was about a little black kid who was reading black history books, and he would time travel through the stories and go and meet these really famous historical. And they have them collected. It's very rare, but they were comic strips, right? And so they collected all these into a little book, and I managed to pay a lot of money for it, but I managed to get it, because it's an artifact, it's an artifact of our history. A lot of people don't know about Orrin C. Evans and his brother. They created the first collection of black comics in 1947. It was called All Negro Comics, right? And it was a collection of, black images by black cartoonists. It was the only one that they did, and then now it's they never got a chance to do a second one because, well, let's just say that certain parties were interested in them not doing it. Let's just say that. But yeah, so there's only one issue, but you can still find it because it's public domain, so you can actually still find it on Amazon now. Someone republished it. But this is part of our history. Or for instance, Jackie Orms, who was the first black woman to actually have a syndicated cartoon strip. There's a book about her by Nancy Goldstein, and she's getting inducted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame this year. That's really amazing. And Will Eisner is he's like the Marshall McLuhan of comics to a certain degree, but he's like one of our cartoon heroes. Isn't that great? Isn't that great that she is finally getting inducted into that? Yes, sir.
I was just thinking the local daily press about the only African-American cartoonist was Aaron Magruder's,
Boondocks.
And then he got out of that and he had the TV show, and then I guess he got out of the TV show and that was it or something. I didn't follow up on
What Aaron Magruder's doing? Well, Magruder's next project is a speculative fiction show called Black America, where black people get reparations. It's gonna be an Amazon show. That's his next project. Oh, and he also did this satirical show called Black Jesus. That is, yeah, that's Aaron Magruder as well.
I didn't think that was terribly black.
No. It's all right. It's all right. I'm curious about what he's going to do with the Black America show, though. But that's his next project. It's going to be on Amazon. Yep. Yeah, and to your point about Avery Brooks, you're absolutely right. What an excellent portrayal of not only a black protagonist, but a black family, and generations. Like his father was there. So check this out. So do you remember the episode called Far Beyond the Stars?
It's been so long since I saw that.
Well, here's the thing. So I show it to my students. I teach Afrofuturism classes and stuff. So I always show this because he's having these, the captain, Cisco, he's having these visions, right? Where he's imagining himself as a 1950s black science fiction writer. You ever seen this? And so he's going back and forth through time, and it's a brilliant episode. And so essentially it's about all the different types of discriminatory practices that are happening to him in the past. And so, but it helps him work through an issue in the present, It's a really brilliant episode. It's called Far Beyond the Stars. If you get a chance to check it out. It's heartbreaking, but it's also just really hopeful and beautiful.
I was thinking that the woman played his girlfriend on Deep Space.
She's on the Orville. She's on the Orville right now.
Position now?
On Orville. Yeah. Look at you. You're a geek. I love that. I'm a geek too. That's like, yeah, she's just absolutely right. She is. Yeah. No, representation has changed a lot. There's obviously an uptick in, images of people of color across the board in various types of, speculative fantasy work and all kinds of things. I mean, it's changed a lot. There's still a lot of stuff to be done, but man, it's a very different landscape right now. It's a very different landscape, and I'm very hopeful actually. I think even though Black Panther is a super corporate property, is owned by Disney, who owns Marvel, who now owns Fox. What? But there's so many like people who are excited about this film. Okay, so this is so silly, but you know, like on Saturday mornings, you would see like the toy commercials. You know,
Yes.
they just put out a Black Panther toy commercial, right, with a little Asian kid and a little black boy and a little black girl pretending to be Black Panther. And I watched that thing about 70 times. And I actually just kind of got really misty-eyed about it.
Well, that's like the Ava DuVernay Barbies, isn't it?
I guess I didn't know she did that. She did that? Does Ava DuVernay Barbie?
I think it's
Well, yeah. I mean, it's in the same vein.
Huh.
Yeah. What I'm getting at is like representation matters.
Right.
Representation matters. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
so they don't have to. These kids are actually able to pretend to be this character. I think that what's happened is, even though this is a hyper corporate entity, let's not forget that this is Disney. The mouse don't play.
Right.
But a lot of people have actually recolonized Wakanda. Wakanda is a fictitious African country, but we've actually recolonized it with our imagination and our hopes and dreams. Isn't that interesting? Seriously, people have like totally snatched it from this corporate. They don't care. You know, they do not care. Do you know how many tickets I bought? I bought like, I think 12 tickets. I bought some for my wife and my family, and then actually I am paying for Uber to take our nieces and nephews to the opening night to go see it. Seriously, because it's important for them to see themselves like that. Because that's them. You know, that's reflected back at them. That's extremely important. There was this meme going around of this young man, and he hugs the Black Panther poster. He hugs it, and he was like, "Oh my God, you know, white people, that's how you feel every day. This is how you feel every day, you know, because this is us, you know." You know, and you take it for granted if you're, you know, same thing, you know, with any person in power, you know, it feels, you don't know what it feels like to not be represented, you know, because it's like breathing, you know. And so he was like, man, you know, this feels great, you know, seriously. And now for it to be like breaking records already, it's not even out. Not to mention the Black Lightning film, TV show. Have y'all seen the Black Lightning TV show on the CW? It's pretty good. It's pretty good, yeah. And it's already like, you know, breaking records for the CW, you know. What happens when you actually if you enable everyone to dream with you, man, come on. You change the world. You change the world. And at the end of the day, I think that's what Dr. King was trying to get at with that mountaintop reference, right? That if you allow all these different things to happen, you know, we move forward as a people together. We rise or we fall together, you know. And I think that through these different types of narratives, we can imagine those spaces and then bring, you know, through imagination, you know, inspire us to move forward with those things. So for instance, all these kids that are seeing Black Panther and seeing Black Lightning and seeing the Falcon and seeing Misty Knight, you know, they can become their own superheroes and then push together, you know. That's why I think, and narrative is how we fight back against these things. We've always used stories, dance, all the different cultural production aspects to overcome. That's a song I used to hear in my church, right?
Right.
Yes, so.
I hate to say, well, yeah, I am fine with another question. I guess it's 5 o'clock, and that was an amazing ending, but I don't, I don't
totally
want
jacked me up.
anyone
Go
to
ahead,
be left
please.
out.
Thinking more about film and TV.
Mhm.
Images of African Americans in film and TV that you are not happy about. That are either incorrect or a white person's.
You know, okay, that's a great question. I think that traditionally there have been like resurgences of constructions of what, you know, a lot of people call the black buck stereotype, like the angry black man stereotype or the thug stereotype. You know, for instance, if you look at like a lot of 90s era film around like, you know, these kind of gang exploitation films, like, you know, Menace to Society and things of that nature. Some are better than others, you know. But I think recently when I saw The Shape of Water, I had some issues with Octavia Spencer's character a little bit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I love that film. Don't get me wrong, I am a huge fan of Guillermo del Toro. I think he's one of the finest filmmakers working right now. I really do. He's a.
almost as good as Pan's Labyrinth.
It was very close. It was very.
Kind of it's hard to top that one.
It's a brilliant film. But I did think that Octavia Spencer's character seemed to be an extension of the protagonist's whims and her voice and not necessarily having her own agency. And maybe that was intentional because it was like a 1950s era film, you know, and it was talking about how blackness is shown in 1950s. But did she have to be cleaning up, you know, and then also how her husband was shown as being a cowardly man, you know, and not supportive of his wife, you know. It was, you know, I'm sure that there are a lot of husbands that are like that. But here's the thing, though, when you actually have like a spectrum of different types of representations, for instance, you know, I was a fan of All in the Family and Crazy Archie Bunker. That dude, man, it's a good show. I'm a fan of Married with Children, right? And also, if you look at the cartoons like Homer Simpson, right? You know, but you can't have all of those negative-oriented stereotypes without having a Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver, or, you know, this spectrum, this continuum of really, really positive representations of people to get to the point where you can actually show humanity, right? So we can't really afford to have super negative images at the moment, you know, because there's not enough out there, you know, because people are lazy. People don't do research. I'm sorry, unless you're a researcher. If you see something on television, you know, and you don't know someone who's gay or black or Chinese, you'll accept those stereotypes and not even do any more digging. You know, that's just how we go. We're too busy to do anything else, right? So, you know, I think for the most part, the stuff that I've seen, I have seen a lot more care in creating an entire person. You know, because a stereotype is a thing. You know, but a true character, you love them, you hate them, you wanna know more about them. You know, a great character, even though he's a villain, Mr. Glass from Unbreakable by M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah.
That's my favorite M. Night Shyamalan. That is a great character. You know, that's a great character because you understand why he became a villain. You understand why he's traumatized. You can see he's a person. You know what I'm saying? And he's brilliant. And he's like, his wrath is present right under his little purple coat, you know, and he's an amazing character, you know, even though he's killed a lot of people in the movie, you understand why he does it to a certain degree, or you maybe empathize with him, and that's a character, you know what I'm saying? So I want more of that to happen, you know, because we deserve it. Everyone deserves to see themselves in the society that they participate in, you know, that we deserve it.
All right. Well, can we thank John Jennings?
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I appreciate it too.